The Civil War was fought between the northern and the southern states from 1861 to 1865. The issues of slavery divided the South and the North because both sides had different beliefs, so some states left the U.S. and built the Confederate States. The war began when Southern troops bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The interest of the North was to maintain the U.S. as a single undivided country, and the interest of the South was to secede from the Union to protect the right to own slaves. Lincoln was president during the war, and he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the South. The Confederates were fighting defensively, but the North had more men and war materials than the South, which caused that the North won the Civil War, and the Confederacy were readmitted to the United States over a long time, which called Reconstruction Era. Dorothea Dix was born in Hampton, Maine in 1802, and she died in 1887. At age 12, she left home to live with her grandmother in Boston and then in Massachusetts by her aunt. In 1819, she returned to Boston and founded the Dix Mansion, a school for girls with a charity school that poor girls could attend for free. 1842, she began teaching Sunday school at the East Cambridge jail, which was a prison for women. She discovered that the prisoners didn't have heat, so she went to court and secured an order to provide heat. She traveled in the whole state to research the conditions in prisons. She was campaigning to establish human asylums for the mentally ill. She also went to Europe and recommended new reforms there. She came back 5 years before the war started. Then she was responsible for setting up field hospitals, etc. After war, she returned to her work on behalf of the mentally ill. Harriet Tubman was born in 1820 and she died in 1913. Tubman was born as Aminata Ross, but she adopted the first name of her mother and the last name of her first husband. She was born as a slave, and when she escaped to Pennsylvania, she became free. She returned a lot of times to Maryland to rescue family and non-family members from slavery. Harriet got the nickname Moses. Her work was a constant threat to her own freedom and safety. She was an active proponent of women's suffrage and worked during the Civil War for the Union Army. She helped a lot of slaves to escape through her system, which was called the Underground Railroad. She had a daughter which she adopted with her second husband after the Civil War. She had a whole lifetime headaches and vivid dreams as a result of a traumatic head injury which she had as a child. Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 in Kentucky, and when he was 8 he moved to Indiana. Lincoln was captain in the Black Hawk War, and he spent 8 years in the Illinois legislature and rode a circuit of courts for many years. In 1842, Lincoln married Mary Todd, and they had together 4 boys, but only one of them lived to maturity. In 1858, Lincoln ran against Douglas for senator. He lost the election, but in the debate with Douglas he gained a national reputation that won him Republican nomination for presidency in 1860. He won also the re-election in 1864. As the Union military triumphs against the South, he heralded the end of the war. On April 14th in 1865, Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater in Washington by an actor who thought that Lincoln was helping the South. Ulysses S. Grant was born in 1822, and he was the son of an Ohio tanner. He went to the West Point University, but against his will, and he graduated in the middle of his class. At the outbreak of the Civil War, Grant was working in his father's leather store in Galena, Illinois. He was appointed by Governor to command an unruly volunteer regiment. Grant whipped it into shape, and by September 1861 he had risen to the rank of Brigadier General of Volunteers. Lincoln appointed him General-in-Chief in 1864. As President, Grant presided over the government much as he had run the army. Also, he brought part of his army staff to the White House. During his campaign for re-election in 1872, he was attacked by liberal Republican reformers. Grant had cancer of the throat while he was raising money against death to produce a memoir. He died in 1885.
Thomas Edison, born on February 11, 1847. He was born in Million, Ohio. He was an hyperactive child and he was prone to distractions. Homeschooled by his mother, he had hearing problems. He had lost most of it as a child. It led him to try to invent new equipment that relied on sight rather than sound. Edison saved a 3-year-old from being run over by an errant train. The child's grateful father rewarded him by teaching him to operate a telegraph. He worked at age 16 as a telegraph operator. The first major invention was a machine to report stock prices at age 22. He used the money he made from selling the stock price machine to build the Menlo Park complex, where he and his team developed lots of new inventions. Some of the bigger things he created was the telegraph, phonograph, electric light bulb, alkaline storage batteries, and kinetograph, a camera used for motion pictures. Sitting Bull was born in South Dakota. He belonged to the Hunkpapa Band, one of the 7 Lakota Sioux groups that lived by hunting buffalo. He joined his first war party at age 14. He was a famed fighter and was named Hunkpapa War Chief in his late 20s, distinguished himself by knocking a Crow warrior from his horse with a tomahawk. He was the first man to become chief of the entire Lakota Sioux Nation, fought in Battle of Killdeer Mountain. In 1881, he was captured and held prisoner in the Dakota Territory until 1883. On December 15, 1890, Sitting Bull was shot and killed. President Jackson was born March 15, 1767. Jackson killed a man named Charles Dixon in a duel. Jackson was shot by Charles Dixon. The bullet missed his heart by barely more than an inch. He won the popular vote for president 3 times. He was the target of the first attempted presidential assassination by Richard Lawrence. He was the only president to have been a former prisoner of war. He was a lawyer. He gained the national fame when he won a decisive victory over the main British invasion at the Battle of New Orleans. He adopted 2 Native American boys. He died June 8, 1845 from chronic tuberculosis. Sand Creek Massacre started in November 1864, located in Colorado Territory, Kiowa County, Colorado. United States lost 24 people and 52 were wounded. The Indians lost 70 to 163. U.S. Army Colonel John Chivington ordered the massacre of the Indians. Over 2/3 that were killed and maimed were women and children. 1851, the Treaty of Fort Laramie gave Indians excessive territory. In 1861, the Treaty of Fort Wise was signed by Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho chiefs, which took most of the land given to the Indians in the earlier treaties. 1864, Chivington began to attack several Cheyenne camps in Colorado. In 1864, while Indians were trying to establish a truce, the majority Indian men were out hunting, and Chivington and his 700 groups attacked the Indians' campsite near Fort Lyon. More than 100 Indians were killed. Chivington killed and scalped 3 women and 5 children who had surrendered. He would mutilate, scalp the dead, including pregnant women, children, and babies. Unfortunately, Chivington and his men were not charged for this massacre. Helen Hunt Jackson was born on October 15, 1830. She was born in Amherst, Massachusetts. She lost her mother at 15 and her father died 3 years later. She was an American poet and writer. Hunt expressed her griefs in poems that she sent to New York Evening Post. She attended Ipswich Female Seminary and the Abbott Institute boarding school in New York. She married Lieutenant Edward Hunt of the Coast Survey Department, activist on behalf of improved treatment of Native Americans by the U.S. government. Helen Hunt Jackson's first novel was Mercy Philbrick's Choice in 1876. She was appointed by the U.S. government as special commissioner to investigate the conditions of Mission Indians because her interest in the condition of Western Indians.
We'll be beginning our World War I tour with 2 of the most influential sociologists of the time period. They greatly helped influence how we think of civil rights today. Born on February 23, 1868, W.E.B. Du Bois was a prominent political figure and advocate for African American rights until his death. He attended Fisk University using money his church had donated to him to sponsor his education, and he went on to complete graduate work at Harvard and the University of Berlin. This hard work allowed him to become the first African American to earn a doctorate. Du Bois was a co-founder of the NAACP. He insisted that African Americans should be given full civil rights, and he heavily opposed Booker T. Washington's plan of compromise, despite them working on the same team for a time. He was involved in a number of vocal protests, including one about draft discrimination against African Americans. Du Bois predicted in 1918 that World War I would be a catalyst for social and political change and the collapse of the European colonial system. Booker T. Washington was also an important black political figure and sociologist of the time, born on April 5, 1856, in Halesford, Virginia. He attended schools that are now known as Hampton University and Virginia Union University. Washington was a strong advocate for African American rights, but his approach was different than that of Du Bois. Washington believed that a slow integration into a white society while submitting to white rule would allow for African Americans to prosper in business and manufacturing worlds. He did work with Du Bois for a time, but they eventually went their separate ways. In 1887, Washington was named the first leader of the new Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. This institution was known as the Tuskegee Machine by white critics of the North. Despite his mostly peaceful ways, his efforts were still a major cause of the upheaval of African Americans around World War I. Our next glimpse of the World War I era has us looking at one of the wealthiest men in modern history, John Davison Rockefeller, Sr., born July 8, 1939, was the founder of Standard Oil and held one of the largest monopolies in general that the capitalistic world has ever seen. He controlled up to 90% of U.S. oil at the peak of his business, and his skillful hand at business earned him billions of dollars. With that money, he lived a very comfortable life, but he never drank or smoked. He used his oil profits to found the University of Chicago and Rockefeller University. He believed in the system of capitalism on the principles of social Darwinism. That is, he believed that the business world was simply a matter of survival of the fittest. He funded relief efforts for unemployed coal miners following an event known as the Ludlow Massacre, but that same event was widely believed to be his fault. Eventually, Rockefeller died of arteriosclerosis in 1937, on May 23rd. A more significant figure in the World War I era goes by the name of Elsie Inglis. Born in Nainital, India, on August 16, 1864, Inglis was a woman dedicated on entering the medical field. She completed her studies at her own breakaway college after attending the Edinburgh School because she didn't like the way that Edinburgh was run, and she completed her medical training at the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. She was the honorary secretary of the Scottish Federation of Women's Suffrage Societies from 1906 to 1914, after which she established the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service in 1914. She was denied funding for the SWH by the Scottish Red Cross, so she funded it herself. She often waived her patients' medical bills, and she even paid for their recovery. The SWH went on to save many lives over the course of World War I, all thanks to a woman whose services were often denied because she was a woman. Within any war setting, one of the most important events during it is often its catalyst. In this case, the catalyst for World War I was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. Occurring on June 24, 1914, the assassination was carried out by a handful of men from a group known as the Young Bosnians in retaliation to the recent annexation of provinces located within Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Young Bosnians were supposedly armed by the terrorist organization Black Hand, and they may have had ties to the Serbian government, but none of this is quite certain. The assassination occurred on the final day of a visit to a neighboring country, a visit that the Archduke had been encouraged not to take. With the last contact he made to the rest of his family having been a telegram to his eldest son in congratulations on his recent test scores, the Archduke and Duchess were both killed by bullet shots. A total of 7 young Bosnians were prepared to assassinate the Archduke, but only 4 managed to get an attempt at doing so, and even then, only 2 of those men actually made the attempt. Exactly 5 years following the Archduke's assassination, the Treaty of Paris would be signed, which would end the war that the deaths had even started.
Nellie Taylor Ross was born on November 29, 1876. Her husband was William Bradford Ross and was the governor of Wyoming in 1920. After he died of an An appendectomy? After he died of an appendectomy, she decided to run for governess and eventually won. She ran for the Democratic Party and was inaugurated on January 5th, 1925. She ended up not being as politically active as her husband before her. Mary McLeod Bethune was born on July 10, 1875, and was one of 17 children in her family. Her parents were both former slaves and then current family farm owners. She received a scholarship to Scotina Seminary and graduated in 1898. Married Albertus Bethune in the same year. She then went to Dwight Moody's Institute for Home and Foreign Missions. After graduating, she went back to South to become a teacher. She was a civil rights activist during the 1920s. By the year 1929, 4 million Americans had invested in the stock market. Even though it continued to climb, it showed serious problems. On October 29th of 1929, 16,410,030 shares were traded on that day in New York. On that one day, stocks fell by 80%, and the Great Depression began. Half of America's banks failed, and unemployment raised to 30%. On November 23rd, it hit rock bottom, and it took over 23 years to recover. Yes. Herbert Hoover was born in Iowa and was most of his life a millionaire tycoon. During World War I, he was a humanitarian, and in 1929, he ran for the Republican office and became the 31st president of the United States. During his presidency, he didn't even try to stop the Great Depression. He thought that Americans would solve it themselves. He failed to see the problems of the poor American. And when his second term, he lost. I don't know, to some other guy. Henry Ford was born in 1863 in Michigan. In 1896, he invented the quadricycle, and in 1903, he formed his own motor company. In 1908, he invented the first Model T. His business plans and economic decisions revolutionized American industry in the 1920s. He created the first assembly line and created the first interchangeable parts. He was the first to allow workers to take off Saturdays and Sundays, and he also raised pay from $2.34 to $5 a day. He invented the V8 engine in 1930.